Hi, everybody. I hope you had a really good weekend. So, we're here for the third installment of Chuck Palahniuk's Lullaby. And hopefully, people will join us shortly so I can know if I'm even broadcasting because I can't tell. And I had that mishap the first time. So, if you guys could just tell me if you could hear me, that would be awesome. Hi, Darksea. Thank you for joining me today. I think we'll probably get through like 10 chapters. That's about the rate we've been going. And, oh, great. That's awesome. Thank you, Darksea. Good to know. I hope you had a really good weekend. And we'll probably have to do this in 4 parts. So the fourth part, I'm just thinking, let's see if we get to chapter 31, let's just say. Yeah, it'll be fine. I'll just like the fourth part, I'll just go like a little bit longer than 2 hours if I need to. Hi, Mahala Mueller. Thank you for joining us. Okay, you guys, I'm going to start. So, this is chapter 21 in Lullaby. Oh, and by the way, we're having a major thunderstorm and lightning storm, which we never ever do in California, in Southern California. So you might hear some of that, and it probably won't be really good for ambiance because it's not fake. It'll be like rumbling. So I don't know if it'll happen or not, but that's what it is if you hear some kind of rumbling. If not, it's just Odin, my dog, snoring. Hi, Steph. Thanks for being here. Okay. This wasn't just one night. It just feels that way. This was every night through Texas and Arizona, on into Nevada, cutting through California, and up through Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Montana. Every night driving in a car is the same, wherever. Every place is the same place in the dark. My son Patrick isn't dead, Helen Hoover Boyle says. He's dead in the county medical records, but I don't say anything. With Helen driving, Mona and Oyster are asleep in the back seat. Asleep or listening. I sit in the passenger side of the front seat, leaning against my door. I am as far from Helen as I can get. With my head pillowed in my arm, I'm where I can listen without looking at her. And Helen talks to me without looking back. This is both of us, looking straight ahead at the road, in the headlights rushing under the hood of the car. Patrick's at the new Continuum Medical Center, she says, and I fully believe that someday he'll make a complete recovery. Her daily planner book, bound in red leather, is on the front seat between us. Driving through North Dakota and Minnesota, I ask, how did she find the culling spell? And with one pink fingernail, she pushes a button somewhere in the dark and puts the car in cruise control. With something else in the dark, she turns on the high beam headlights. I used to be a client representative for Skin Tone Cosmetics, she says. The trailer we lived in wasn't very nice, she says. My husband and I. His name is John Boyle in the county medical records. You know how it is with your first, she says. People give you so many toys and books. I don't even know who actually bought the book. It was just a book in a pile of books. According to the county, this must have been 20 years ago. You don't need me to tell you what happened, she says. but John always thought it was my fault. According to police records, there were 6 domestic disturbance calls to the Boyle home, Lot 175 at the Buena Noche Mobile Park. In the weeks following the death of Patrick Raymond Boyle, aged 6 months. Driving through Wisconsin and Nebraska, Helen says, I was going door to door, cold calling for skin tone, she says. I didn't go back to work right away. It must have been, God, a year and a half after the morning we found Patrick. She was walking around the trailer development where they lived, Helen tells me, and she met a young woman just like the woman wearing the apron patterned with little chickens. The same dead funeral flowers brought home from the mortuary, the same empty crib. I could make a lot of money just selling heavy foundation and cover-up, Helen says, smiling, especially toward the end of the month when money was tight. 20 years ago, this other woman was the same age as Helen, and while they talked, she showed Helen the nursery, the baby pictures. The woman's name was Cynthia Moore. She had a black eye. And I saw they had a copy of the same book, Helen says, poems and rhymes from around the world. These other people kept it open to the same page it was the night their child died. The book, the bedding in the crib, they were trying to keep everything the same. Of course, it was the same page as our book, Helen says. At the home, John Boyle was drinking a lot of beer every night. He said he didn't want to have another child because he didn't trust her. If she didn't know what she'd done wrong, it was too much of a risk. With my hand on her heated leather seats, it feels as if I'm touching another person. Driving through Colorado, Kansas, and Missouri, she says. The other mother in the trailer park, one day, there was a yard sale at their place. All their baby things, all folded in piles on the lawn, marked $0.25 apiece. There was the book, and I bought it, Helen says. I asked the man inside why Cindy was selling everything, and he just shrugged. According to county medical records, Cynthia Moore drank liquid drain cleaner and died of esophageal hemorrhaging and asphyxiation 3 months after her child had died of no apparent cause. John was worried about germs, so he'd burned all of Patrick's things, she said. I bought the book of poems for 10 cents. I remember it was a beautiful day outside. Police records show 3 more domestic disturbance calls to Lot 175 at the Buena Noche Mobile Home Park. A week after Cynthia Moore's suicide, John Boyle was found dead with no apparent cause. According to the county, his high blood alcohol concentration might have caused sleep apnea. Another likely cause was positional asphyxiation. He may have been so drunk that he felt unconscious in a position that kept him from breathing. Either way, there was no marks on the body. There was no apparent cause of death on the death certificate. Driving through Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, Helen says, killing John wasn't anything I did on purpose, she says. I was just curious. The same as me and Duncan. It was just testing a theory, she says. John kept saying that Patrick's ghost was with us, and I kept telling him that Patrick is still alive in the hospital. 20 years later, baby Patrick's still in the hospital, she says. Crazy as this sounds, I don't say anything. How a baby must look after 20 years in a coma or on life support or whatever, I can't imagine. Picture Oyster on a feeding tube and a catheter for most of his life. There are worse things you can do to people you love than kill them. In the back seat, Mona sits up and stretches her arms. She says, in ancient Greece, people wrote their strongest curses with the nails from shipwrecks, she says. Sailors who died at sea weren't given a proper funeral. The Greeks knew that dead people who aren't buried are the most restless and destructive spirits. And Helen says, "Shut up." Driving through West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New York, Helen says, "I hate people who claim they can see ghosts," she says. "There are no ghosts. When you die, you're dead. There's no afterlife. People who claim they can see ghosts are just looking for attention. People who believe in reincarnation are just postponing their lives." She smiles. "Fortunately for me," she says, "I found a way to punish those people and make a great deal of money." Her cell phone rings. She says, "If you don't believe me about Patrick, I can show you this month's hospital bill." Her phone rings again. We're driving across Vermont when she says this. She says, part of it while we're crossing Louisiana in the dark, then Arkansas and Mississippi. All those little eastern states. Some nights we'd cross 2 or 3. Flipping her phone open, she says, "This is Helen." She rolls her eyes at me and says, "An invisible lady sealed, an invisible baby sealed inside your bedroom wall, and it cries all night." Really? Other parts of this story I didn't know until we got home, and I did some research. Pressing the phone against her chest, Helen tells me, "Everything I'm telling you is strictly off the record," she says. "Until we find the Book of Shadows, we can't change what's happening. Using a spell from that book, I'll make sure Patrick makes a full recovery." Chapter 22. We're driving through the Midwest with the radio on some AM station, and a man's voice says how Dr. Sarah Lowenstein was a beacon of hope and morality in the wasteland of modern life. Dr. Sarah was a noble, hard-line moralist who refused to accept anything but steadfast, righteous conduct. She was a bastion of upright standards, a lamp that shone its light to reveal the evil in this world. Dr. Sarah, the man says, will always be in our hearts and souls because of her own soul was so strong and so, the voice stops. And Mona hits the back of the front seat, hits right behind my kidneys and says, "Not again," she says. "Quit venting your personal issues on innocent people." And I say for her to stop accusing. Maybe it's just sunspots. These talkaholics, these listenophobics. The culling song spun through my head so fast I didn't even notice. I was half asleep. It's that far out of control. I can kill in my sleep. After a few miles of silence, what radio journalists call dead air, another man's voice comes on the radio saying how Dr. Sarah Lowenstein was the moral yardstick against which millions of radio listeners measured their own lives. She was the flaming sword of God, sent down to root the misdeeds and evildoers from the temple of... And this new man's voice cuts off. Mona hits the back of my seat hard, saying, "That's not funny. Those radio preachers are real people." And I say, "I didn't do anything." And Helen and Oyster giggle. Mona crosses her arms over her chest and throws herself back against the rear seat. She says, "You have no respect. None. This is 1,000,000 years of power you're screwing around with." Mona puts both hands against Oyster and shoves him away hard, so he hits the door. She says, "You too," she says. "A radio personality is just as important as a cow or a pig." Now dance music comes on the radio. Helen's cell phone starts to ring, and she flips it open and presses it into her hair. She nods at the radio and mouths the words, "Turn it down." Into the phone, she says, "Yes?" She says, "Uh-huh, yes. I know who he is. Tell me where he's at right now, as close as you can pinpoint it." I turn down the radio. Helen listens and says, "No," she says. "I want a 75-carat fancy cut blue-white diamond. Call Mr. Drescher in Geneva. He knows the exact one I want." Mona pulls her knapsack up from the floor of the back seat, and she takes out a pack of colored felt tip pens and a thick book bound in dark green brocade. She opens the book across her lap and starts scribbling in it with a blue pen. She caps the blue pen and starts with a yellow one. And Helen says, "How much security doesn't matter. It'll be done inside the hour." She flips the phone shut and drops it in the seat beside her. On the front seat between us is her daily planner, and she flips it open and writes a name and today's date inside. The book in Mona's lap is her mirror book. All real witches, she says, keep mirror books. It's a kind of diary and cookbook where you collect what you learn about magic and rituals. "For instance," she says, reading from her mirror book, "Democritus says that burning the head of a chameleon on an oak fire will cause a thunderstorm." She leans forward and says into my ear, "You know Democritus," she says, "like in the inventor of democracy." And I'm counting 1, counting 2, counting 3. To shut someone up, Mona says, to make them stop talking, take a fish and sew its mouth shut. To cure an earache, Mona says, you need to use the semen of a boar as it drips from a sow's vagina. According to the Jewish Sefer HaRizim collection of spells, you have to kill a black puppy before it sees the light of day. Then write your curse on a tablet and put the tablet inside the dog's head. Then seal the mouth with wax and hide the head behind someone's house, and that person will never fall asleep. According to Theophradatus, Mona reads, you should only dig up a peony at night, because if a woodpecker sees you doing it, you'll go blind. If the woodpecker sees you cutting the plant's roots, your anus will prolapse. And Helen says, I wish I had a fish. According to Mona, you shouldn't kill people because that drives you away from humanity. In order to justify killing, you have to make the victim your enemy. To justify any crime, you have to make the victim your enemy. After long enough, everyone in the world will be your enemy. With every crime, Mona says, you're more and more alienated from the world. More and more, you imagine the whole world is against you. Dr. Sarah Lowenstein didn't start out by attacking and berating everybody who called her radio show, Mona says. She used to have a little time slot and a little audience, and she seemed to really care about helping people. And maybe it was after years and years of getting the same calls about unwanted pregnancies, about divorces, about family squabbles. Maybe it was because her audience grew and her show moved to prime time. Maybe it was more money. Maybe it was more money she earned. Maybe power corrupts. But she wasn't always a bitch. The only way out, Mona says, will be to surrender and let the world kill Helen and me for our crimes. Or we can kill ourselves. I ask if this is more Wiccan nonsense. And Mona says, no, actually, it's Karl Marx. She says, after killing someone, those are the only ways back to connect with humanity. Still drawing in her book, she says, that's the only way you can get back to a place where the world isn't your nemesis, where you're not totally alone. A fish, Helen says, and a needle and a thread. And I'm not alone. I have Helen. Maybe this is why so many serial killers work in pairs. It's nice not to feel alone in a world full of victims or enemies. It's no wonder Walter Wagner, the Australian angel of death, convinced her friends to kill with her. It just seems natural. You and me against the world. Gary Lewington had his brother Thaddeus. Kenneth Bianchi had Angelo Buono. Larry Bittaker had Roy Norris. Doug Clark had Carol Bundy. David Gore had Fred Waterfield. Gwen Graham had Kathy Wood. Doug Gretzler had Bill Steelman. Joe Callinger had his son, Mike. Pat Kearney had Dave Hill. Andy Kokorales had his brother Tom. Leo Lake had Charles Nye. Henry Lucas had Otis Toole. Albert Salami had John Scalasi. Alan Michael had Clement Johnson. Clyde Barrow had Bonnie Parker. Doug Benmore had Keith Cosby. Ian Brady had Myra Hindley. Tom Braun had Leo Maine. Ben Brooks had Fred Triche. John Brown had Sam Cotis. Bill Burke had Bill Hare. Eskreen Burroughs had Larry Tacklin. Jose Bucks had Mariano Macu. Bruce Childs had Henry McKinney. Alton Coleman had Debbie Brown. Anne French had her son Bill. Frank Gusenberg had his brother Peter. Delphina Gonzalez had her sister Maria. Dr. Teet Harum had Dr. Tom Algen. Amelia Sachs had Annie Walters. 13% of all reported serial killers worked in teams. On death row in San Quentin, Randy, the scorecard killer Kraft, played bridge with Doug Sunset Slayer Clark. Larry Pliers Bittaker and freeway killer Bill Bonin. An estimated 126 victims between the four of them. Helen Hoover Boyle has me. I couldn't stop killing, Bonin once told a reporter. It got easier with each one. I have to agree. It does get to be a bad habit. On the radio, it says how Dr. Lowenstein was an angel of unparalleled power and impact, a glorious hand of God, a conscience for the world around her, a world of sin and cruel intent, a world of hate. The more people die, the more things stay the same. Go ahead, prove yourself, Oyster says, and nods at the radio. He says, kill this fucker too. I'm counting 37, counting 38, counting 39. We've disarmed 7 copies of the poems book since leaving home. The original press run was for 500. That makes it 306 copies down, 194 copies to go. In the newspaper, it says how the man in the black leather trench coat, the one who shoved past me at the crosswalk, he was a monthly blood donor. He spent 3 years overseas with the Peace Corps, digging wells for lepers. He gave up a chunk of his liver to a girl in Botswana who ate a poison mushroom. He answered phones during pledge drives against some crippling disease. I forget what. Still, he deserved to die. He called me an asshole. He pushed me. In the newspaper, it shows the mother and father crying over the coffin of my upstairs neighbor. Still, his stereo was too damn loud. In the newspaper, it says a CoverGirl fashion model named Denny DeTestra was found dead in her downtown loft apartment this morning. And for whatever reason, I hope Nash didn't get the call to pick up the body. Oyster points at the radio and says, kill him, Dad, or you're full of shit. Really, this whole world is nothing but assholes. Helen flips open her cell phone and calls ahead to libraries in Oklahoma and Florida. She finds another copy of the poems book in Orlando. Mona reads to us how the ancient Greeks made cursed tablets they called defictiones. The Greeks used kolesi, dolls made of bronze or wax or clay, and they stabbed them with nails or twisted and mutilated them, cutting off the head or hands. They put hair from the victim inside the doll or sealed a curse written on papyrus and rolled inside the doll. In the Louvre Museum is an Egyptian figure from the 2nd century AD. It's a naked woman, hog-tied, with nails stuck in her eyes, her ears, her mouth, breasts, hands, feet, vagina, and anus. Scribbling in her book with an orange felt tip pen, Mona says, "Whoever made that doll, they'd probably love you and Helen." The curse tablets were thin sheets of lead or copper, sometimes clay. You wrote your curse on them with the nail from a shipwreck. Then you rolled the sheet and stuck the nail through it. When writing, you wrote the first line left to right, the next line right to left, the third left to right, and so on. If you could, you folded the curse around some of the victim's hair or a scrap of their clothing. You threw the curse into a lake or a well or the sea, anything that would convey it to the underworld where demons would read it and fill your order. Still talking on her phone, Helen puts it against her chest for a moment and says, "That sounds like ordering stuff over the internet." I'm counting 346, counting 347, counting 348. In the Greco-Roman library tradition, Mona says, there are night witches and day witches. Day witches are good and nurturing. Night witches are secretive and bent on destroying all civilization. Mona says, you two are definitely night witches. These people who gave us democracy and architecture, Mona says, magic was their everyday part of their lives. Businessmen put curses on each other. Neighbors curse neighbors. Near the site of the original Olympic Games, archaeologists have found old wells full of curses placed by athletes on other athletes. Mona says, I'm not making this stuff up. Spells to attract a lover were called agogia in ancient Greek. Curses to ruin a relationship were called diakopio. Helen talks louder into her cell phone saying, blood running down your kitchen walls? Well, of course you shouldn't have to live with that. And into his phone, Oyster says, I need the retail advertising number for the Miami Telegraph Observer. And the radio interrupts everything with a chorus of French horns. A man's deep voice comes on with a teletype clattering in the background. The suspected leader of South America's largest drug cartel has been found dead in his Miami penthouse, the voice says. Gustave Brennan, age 39, is believed to be the point man for almost $3 billion in annual cocaine sales. Police do not have a cause of death, but plan to autopsy the body. And Helen looks at the radio and says, Are you hearing this? This is ridiculous. She says, Listen, and turns up the radio. Brennan, the voice says, who lived inside a fortress of armed bodyguards, has also been under constant FBI surveillance. And to me, Helen says, do they even use teletypes anymore? The call she just got, the blue-white diamond, the name she wrote in her daily planner, it was Gustav Brennan. Chapter 23. Centuries ago, sailors on long voyages used to leave a pair of pigs in every deserted island, or they'd leave a pair of goats. Either way, on any future visit, the island would be a source of meat. These islands, they were pristine. These were home to breeds of birds with no natural predators, breeds of birds that live nowhere else on Earth. The plants there, without enemies that evolved without thorns or poisons, without predators and enemies, these islands, they were paradise. The sailors, the next time they visited these islands, the only things still there would be herds of goats or pigs. Oyster is telling this story. The sailors called this seeding meat. Oyster says, "Does this remind you of anything? Maybe the old Adam and Eve story?" Looking out the car window, he says, "You ever wonder when God's coming back with a lot of barbecue sauce?" Outside is some great lake, water stretched to the horizon. Nothing but zebra mussels and lamprey eels, Oyster says. The air stinks with rotting fish. Mona has a pillow of barley and lavender pressed over her face with both hands. The red henna designs on the back of her hands spread down the length of each finger. Red snakes and vines twisted together. His cell phone rings and Oyster pulls out the antenna. He puts it to his head and says, "Demir Davis and Hope, attorneys at law." He twists a finger in his nose, then takes it out and looks at the finger. Into his phone, Oyster says, "How long after eating there did the diarrhea manifest itself?" He sees me looking and flicks the finger at me. Helen, with her own cell phone, says, "The people who lived there before were very happy. It was a beautiful house." In the local newspaper, the Erie Register Sentinel, an ad in the entertainment section says, "Attention, patrons of the Country House Golf Club." The ad says, "Have you contracted a medication-resistant staph infection from the swimming pool or locker room facilities? If so, please call the following number to be part of a class action lawsuit." You know the number is Oyster's cell phone. In the 1870s, Oyster says, a man named Spencer Baird decided to play God. He decided the cheapest form of protein for Americans was a European carp. For 20 years, he shipped baby carp to every part of the country. He convinced 100 different railroads to carry his baby carp and release them in every body of water their trains passed. He even outfitted special railroad tanker cars that carried 9-ton shipments of baby carp to every watershed in North America. Helen's phone rings and she flips it open. Her daily planner open on the seat next to her, she says. "And where exactly is His Royal Highness at this time?" And she writes a name under today's date in the book. Into her phone, Helen says, "Ask Mr. Drescher to get me the pair of citron and emerald clips." In another newspaper, the Cleveland Herald Monitor, the lifestyle section is an ad that says, "Attention, patrons of the apparel design chain of clothing stores." The ad says, "If you've contracted genital herpes while trying on clothing, please call the following number and be part of a class action lawsuit." And again, the same number, Oyster's number. In 1890, Oyster says, another man decided to play God. Eugene Scheffenfelen released 60 Sturnus vulgarius, the European starling, into New York Central Park. 50 years later, the birds had spread to San Francisco. Today, there are more than 200 million starlings in America. All this because Scheffenlen wanted the New World to include every bird mentioned by Shakespeare. And into his cell phone, Oyster says, "No, sir, your name will be held in the strictest confidence." Helen flips her phone shut and she cups a gloved hand over her nose and mouth, saying, "What is that awful smell?" And Oyster puts his cell phone against his shirt and says, "Owl wife die off." Ever since they re-engineered the Welland Canal in 1921 to allow more shipping around Niagara Falls, he says, the sea lamprey has infested all of the Great Lakes. These parasites suck the blood of the larger fish, the trout and salmon, killing them. Then the smaller fish are left with no predators, and their population explodes. Then they run out of plankton to eat and starve by the millions. Stupid, greedy alewives, Oyster says. Remind you of any other species? He says, either a species learns to control its own population or something like disease, famine, war will take care of the issue. Mona's muffled voice through her pillow, she says, don't tell them. They won't understand. And Helen opens her purse on the seat beside her. She opens it with one hand and takes out a polished cylinder. With the air conditioning on high, she sprays breath freshener on the handkerchief and holds it over her nose. She sprays breath freshener into the air conditioning vents and says, is this about the culling poem? And without turning around, I say, you'd use the poem for population control? And Oyster laughs and says, kind of. Mona lowers the pillow to her lap and says, this is about the grimoire. And punching another number into a cell phone, Oyster says, if we find it, we all have to share it. And I say, we're destroying it. After we read it, Helen says. And into his phone, Oyster says, yes, I'll hold. And to us, he says, this is so typical. We have the entire power structure of Western society in this one car. According to Oyster, the dads have all the power, so they don't want anything to change. He means me. I'm counting 1, counting 2, counting 3. Oyster says all the moms have a little power, but they're hungry for more. He means Helen. I'm counting 4, counting 5, counting 6. And young people, he says, have little or no power, so they're desperate for any. Oyster and Mona. I'm counting 7, counting 8, and Oyster's voice goes on and on. This quietophobic, this talkaholic. Smiling with just half his mouth, Oyster says, every generation wants to be the last. Into the phone, he says, yeah, I'd like to place a retail display ad, he says. Yeah, I'll hold. Mona puts the pillow back over her face. The red snakes and vines go down the length of each finger. Cheat grass, Oyster says, mustard, kudzu, carp, starlings, seeding meat. Looking out the car window, Oyster says, you ever wonder if Adam and Eve were just the puppies God dumped because they wouldn't house train? He rolls down the window and the smell blows inside, the stinking warm wind of dead fish, and shouting against the wind, he says, maybe humans are just the pet alligators that God flushed down the toilet. Chapter 24. At the next library, I asked to wait in the car while Helen and Mona go inside and find the book. With them gone, I flip through the pages of Helen's daily planner. Almost every day is a name. Some of the names I know. The dictator of some banana republic or a figure from organized crime. Each name crossed out with a single red slash. The last dozen names I write on a scrap of paper. Between the names are Helen's notes from meetings, her handwriting scrolled and perfect as jewelry. Watching me from the back seat, Oyster's kicked back with his arms folded behind his head. His bare feet are crossed and propped up on the back of the front seat, so they hang next to my face. A silver ring around one of his big toes. Calluses on the soles. The gray calluses are cracked, dirty, And Oyster says, Mom's not going to like that, you going through her personal secret shit. Reading the book backward from today's date, I go through 3 years of names, assassinations, before Helen and Mona are walking back through the parking lot. Oyster's phone rings and he answers it. Donner, Diller, and Dunes, attorney at law. There's still most of the book I didn't get a chance to read. Years and years of pages. Toward the end of the book, there are years and years of blank pages for Helen still to fill. Helen's talking on her phone when she gets back to the car. She's saying, No, I want the step-cut aquamarine that used to belong to the Emperor Zog. Mona gets into the back seat saying, Did you miss us? She says. Another culling song down the toilet. And Oyster folds his legs into the back seat saying, Does the rash bleed? Into his cell phone. Helen snaps her fingers for me to hand her the daily planner. Into the phone, she says, Yes, the 200-carat aquamarine. Call Drescher in Geneva. She opens the planner and writes a name under today's date. Mona says, I was thinking, she says, do you think the original grimoire might have a flying spell? I'd love that. Or an invisibility spell? She gets her mirror book out of her knapsack and starts coloring in it. She says, I want to be able to talk to animals too. Oh, and do telekinesis, move stuff with my mind. Helen starts the car and says, loud at the rearview mirror, I'm sewing my fish. She puts her cell phone and her pen in her purse. Still in her purse is a small gray stone from Mona's witch party, the stone the coven gave to her when Oyster was naked, his wrinkled pink stasselite of skin pierced with its little silver ring. Mona, that same night, mulberry, and the two muscles of her back, the way they split into the two firm, creamy white halves of her ass. And I'm counting 1, counting 2, counting 3. In the next little town, in the next library, I ask Helen and Mona to wait in the car with Oyster while I go inside and hunt for the poems book. This is some small town library in the middle of the day. A librarian is behind the checkout desk. The most recent newspapers are mounted in the big hardcover bindings you sit at a big table to read. In today's paper is Gustav Brennan. In yesterday's is some wacko religious leader in the Middle East. 2 days ago, it was some death row inmate on his latest appeal. Everyone in Helen's planner book died on the date their name is listed. In between the newspaper articles or something worse. Denny did Testros today. 3 days ago, it's Samantha Ivian. A week ago, it's Dot Leon. All of them young, all of them fashion models, all of them found dead without an apparent cause of death. Before that was Mimi Gonzalez, found dead by her boyfriend, dead in bed with no marks, nothing. No clues until the autopsy announced today shows signs of postmortem sexual intercourse. Nash. When Helen comes in asking, I'm hungry, what's taking you so long? My list of names is on the table beside me. Next to it is a newspaper article with the photo of Gustav Brennan. In front of me is another article showing the funeral of some convicted child molester I found listed in Helen's daily planner. And Helen looks at everything in one glance and says, So now you know. She sits on the edge of the table, her thighs stretching her skirt tight across her lap, and says, You wanted to know how to control your power. Well, this is what works for me. The secret is to churn prose, she says. Do something only for money, and you're less likely to do it for free. You don't think prostitutes want a lot of sex outside of the brothel? She says. She says, why do you think building contractors always live in unfinished houses? She says, why do you think doctors are in such poor health? She waves her hand at the library door and the parking lot outside and says, the only reason I haven't killed Mona 100 times over is because I kill someone else every day, and I get paid a great deal of money for it. And I ask, what about Mona's idea? Why can't you control the power by just loving people so much you don't want to kill them? This isn't about love and hate, Helen says. It's about control. People don't sit down and read a poem to kill their child. They just want the child to sleep. They just want to dominate. No matter how much you love somebody, you still want to have your own way. The masochist bullies the sadist into action. The most passive person is actually an aggressor. Every day, just you living means the misery and death of plants and animals, and even some people. Slaughterhouses, factory farms, sweatshops, she says. Like it or not, that's what your money buys. And I tell her she's been listening to Oyster too much. The key is to kill people deliberately, Helen says, and picks up the picture of Gustav Brennan in the newspaper. Looking at it up close, she says, you kill strangers deliberately so you don't accidentally kill the people you love. Constructive deconstruction, she says. I'm an independent contractor. She's an international hired killer working for huge diamonds. Helen says, governments do it every day. But governments do it after years of deliberation and by due process, I tell her. It's only after weighty consideration that a criminal is deemed too dangerous to be released, or to set an example, or for revenge. Okay, so the process isn't perfect. At least it's not arbitrary. And Helen puts a hand over her eyes to hide them for a moment, then moves her hand and looks at me, saying, who do you think calls me for these little jobs? The US State Department calls her. Sometimes, she says, mostly it's other countries. Any country in the world, but I don't do anything for free. That's why the jewels. I hate haggling over the exchange rate, don't you? She says. Besides, an animal dies for every meal you eat. Oyster again. I see my job will be keeping him and Helen apart. And I say, that's different. Humans are above animals. Animals were put on this planet to feed and serve humanity. Human beings are precious and intelligent and unique, and God gave the animals to us. They're our property. Of course you'd say that, Helen says. You're on the winning team. I say, constructive deconstruction isn't the answer I was looking for. And Helen says, sorry, it's the only one I have. She says, let's get the book, fix it, and then go kill ourselves some lovely pheasant for lunch. On the way out, I asked the librarian for their copy of the poems book, but it's checked out. The details about the librarian are, he has frosted streaks of ash blonde in his hair, and the hair's gelled into a solid awning over his face. Sort of an ash blonde visor. He's sitting on a stool behind a computer monitor and smells like cigarette smoke. He's wearing a turtleneck sweater with a plastic name tag that says Simon. I tell him that a lot of lives depend on me finding that book. And he says, too bad. And I say, no, the fact is only his life depends on it. And the librarian hits a button on his keyboard and says he's calling the police. Wait, Helen says, and spreads her hand on the counter. Her fingers sparkling and loaded with step-cut emeralds and cabochon star sapphires and black cushion-cut Bort diamonds, she says. Simon, take your pick. And the librarian, his top lip sucks up to his nose so his upper teeth show. He blinks once, twice, slow, and he says, honey, you can keep your tacky drag queen rhinestones. And the smile on Helen's face doesn't even flicker. The man's eyes roll up and the muscles in his face and hands go smooth. His chin drops to his chest and he slumps forward against his keyboard, then twists and slides to the floor. Constructive deconstruction. Helen reaches a priceless hand to turn the monitor and says, damn. Even dead on the floor, he looks asleep. His giant gelled hair broke his fall. Reading the monitor, Helen says, he changed the screen. I need to know his password. No problem. Big Brother fills us with all the same crap. My guess is he was clever the same way everybody thinks they're clever. I tell her to type in password. Chapter 25. Mona rolls the sock off my foot. The stretchy sock insides the fibers. They peel my scabs off. My crusted blood flakes off onto the floor. The foot is swollen until it's smooth with all its wrinkles stretched out. My foot, a balloon spotted red and yellow. With a folded towel under it, Mona pours the rubbing alcohol. The pain's so instant, you can't tell if the alcohol is boiling hot or ice cold. Sitting on the motel bed, my pant leg rolled up, with Mona kneeling on the carpet at my feet, I grab 2 handfuls of bedspread and grit my teeth. My back arched, my every muscle bunches tight for a few long seconds. The bedspread's cold and soaked with my sweat. Pockets of something soft and yellow. These blisters almost cover the bottom of my foot. Under the layer of dead skin, you can see a dark, solid shape inside each blister. Mona says, what have you been walking on? She's heating a pair of tweezers over Oyster's plastic cigarette lighter. I ask what the deal is with the advertisements Oyster's running in newspapers. Is he working for a law firm? The outbreaks of skin fungus and food poisonings, are they for real? The alcohol drips off my foot, pink with dissolved blood, onto the folded motel towel. She sets the tweezers on the damp towel and heats a needle over Oyster's cigarette lighter. With a rubber band, she reaches back and bundles her hair into a thick ponytail. Oyster calls all that anti-advertising, she says. Sometimes businesses, the really rich ones, they pay him to cancel the ads. How much they pay, he says, reflects how true the ads probably are. My foot won't fit inside my shoe anymore. In the car, earlier today, I asked if Mona could look at it. Helen and Oyster are out buying new makeup. They're stopping to diffuse 3 copies of the poems book at a big used bookstore down the street, the Book Barn. I say what Oyster's doing is blackmail. It's casting aspirations. Now, it's almost midnight. Where Helen and Oyster really are, I don't want to know. He's not saying he's a lawyer, Mona says. He's not saying there's a lawsuit. He's just running an ad. Other people fill in the blanks. Oyster says he's just planting the seed of doubt in their minds. She says, Oyster says it's only fair since advertising promises something to make you happy. With her kneeling, you can see the 3 black stars tattooed above Mona's collarbone. You can see down her blouse, past the carpet of chains and pendants, and she isn't wearing a bra. And I'm counting 1, counting 2, counting 3. Mona says, other members of the coven do it too, but it's Oyster's idea. He says the plan is to undermine the illusion of safety and comfort in people's lives. With the needle, she lances a yellow blister and something drops out. A little brown piece of plastic. It's covered in stinking ooze and blood and lands on the towel. Mona turns it over with the needle, and the yellow ooze soaks into the towel. She picks it up with the tweezers and says, "What the heck is this?" "It's a church steeple." I say, "I don't know." Mona, her mouth gapes open with her tongue pushing out. Her throat slides up inside her neck skin, gagging. She waves a hand in front of her nose and blinks fast. The yellow ooze stinks that bad. She wipes the needle on the towel. With one hand, she holds my toes, and with the other, she lances another blister. The yellow sprays out in a little blast, and there on the towel is half of a factory smokestack. She tweezers it and wipes it on the towel, her face wrinkled tight around her nose. She looks at it close up and says, "You want to tell me what's going on?" She lances another blister, and out pops the onion dome from a mosque covered in blood and slime. With her tweezers, Mona pulls a tiny dinner plate out of my foot. It's hand-painted with a border of red roses. Outside our motel room, a fire siren screams by in the street. Out of another blister oozes the pediment from a Georgianian bank building. The cupola from a grade school busts out of the next blister. Sweating. Deep breathing. Gripping my soft, dripping handfuls of bedspread, I grit my teeth. Looking up at this ceiling, I say, "Someone is killing models." Pulling out a bloody flying buttress, Mona says, "By stepping on them?" And I tell her, "Fashion models." The needle digs around in the sole of my foot. The needle fishes out a television antenna. The tweezers fish out a gargoyle, then roof tiles, shingles, tiny slates, and gutters. Mona lifts one edge of the stinking towel and folds it so a clean side shows. She pours on more alcohol. Another fire engine screams by the motel. Its red and blue lights flash across the curtains. And I can't draw another full breath. My foot burns so bad. We need, I say, we need to go back home, I say, as soon as possible. If I'm right, I need to stop the man who's using the culling poem. With the tweezers, Mona digs out a blue plastic shutter and lays it on the towel. She pulls out a shard of bedroom curtains, yellow curtains from the nursery. She pulls out a length of picket fence and pours on more alcohol until it drips off my foot clear. She covers her nose with her hand. Another fire engine screams by and Mona says, "You mind if I just turn on the TV and see what's up?" I stretch my jaws at the ceiling and say, We can't. Alone with her now, I say, "We can't trust Helen. She only wants the grimoire so she can control the world." I say the cure for having too much power is not to get more power. We can't let Helen get her hands on the original Book of Shadows. And so slow, I can't see her move, Mona draws a fluted, iconic column out of a bloody pit below my big toe. Slow as the hour hand on a clock. If the column's from a museum or a church or a college, I can't remember. All these broken homes and trashed institutions. She's more of an archaeologist than a surgeon. And Mona says, "That's funny." She lines up the column with another fragment on the towel. Frowning as she leans back into my soul with her tweezers, she says, "Helen told me the same thing about you. She says you only want to destroy the grimoire." "It should be destroyed. No one can handle that kind of power." On television is an old brick building, 3 stories, with flames pouring up from every window. Firemen point hoses and feathery white arcs of water. A young man holding a microphone steps into the shop, and behind him, Helen and Oyster are watching the fire, their heads leaned together. Oyster's holding a shopping bag. Helen holds his other hand. Holding up the bottle of rubbing alcohol, Mona looks at how much is left. She says, "What I'd really like to be is an empath, where all I have to do is touch people and they're healed." Reading the label, she says, "Helen tells me we can make the world a paradise." And I sit up on the bed, halfway propping myself on my elbows, and I say, "Helen is killing people for diamond tiaras. That's the kind of savior Helen is." Mona wipes the tweezers and the needle on the towel, making more smears of red and yellow. She smells the bottle of alcohol and says, "Helen thinks you only want to exploit the book for a newspaper story. She says once all the spells are destroyed, including the culling spell, then you can blab to everybody that you're the hero." I say, "Nuclear weapons are bad enough. Chemical weapons?" I say, "Certain people have magic is not going to make a world a better place." I tell Mona, if it comes to it, I'll need her help. I say, "We may need to kill Helen." And Mona shakes her head over the bloody ruins on the motel towel. She says, "So your answer for too much killing is more killing." "Just Helen," I say, "and maybe Nash, if my theory about the dead fashion models is right. After we kill them, we can go back to normal." On television, the young man with the microphone, he's saying how a 3-alarm fire has almost all of the downtown area paralyzed. He says the structure is fully involved. He says it's one of the city's favorite institutions. Oyster, Mona says, doesn't like your idea of normal. The burning institution, it's the book barn. And behind him, Helen and Oyster are gone. Mona says, "In a detective story, do you wonder why we root for the detective to win?" She says, "Maybe it's not just for revenge or to stop the killing. Maybe we really want to see the killer redeemed. The detective is the killer's savior. Imagine if Jesus chased you around trying to catch you and save your soul. Not just a patient, passive God, but a hardworking, aggressive bloodhound. We want the criminal to confess during the trial. We want him to be exposed in the drawing room scene, surrounded by his peers. The detective is the shepherd, and we want the criminal back in the fold, returned to us. We love him. We miss him. We want to hug him." Mona says, "Maybe that's why so many women marry killers in prison, to help heal them." I tell her, "There's nobody who misses me." Mona shakes her head and says, "You know, you and Helen are so much like my parents." Mona, Mulberry, my daughter. And flopping back on the bed, I ask, "How's that?" And pulling a door frame out of my foot, Mona says, "Just this morning, Helen told me she might need to kill you." My pager goes off. It's a number I don't know. The pager says it's very important. And Mona digs a stained glass window out of a bloody pit in my foot. She holds it up so the ceiling light comes through the colored bits. And looking at the tiny window, she says, "I'm more worried about Oyster. He doesn't always tell the truth." And the motel room door, right then it blows open. The sirens outside, the sirens on the television, the flash of red and blue light strobing across the window curtains. Right then, Helen and Oyster fall into the room, laughing and panting. Oyster slinging a bag of cosmetics, Helen holding her high heels in one hand. They both smell like Scotch whiskey and smoke. Chapter 26. Imagine a plague you can't catch. Imagine a plague you can catch through your ears. Oyster and his tree-hugging eco bullshit, his bio-invasive apocalyptic bullshit, the virus of his information. What used to be a beautiful deep green jungle to me is now a tragedy of English ivy choking everything else to death. The lovely shining black flocks of starlings with their creepy whistling songs, they rob the nests of 150 native birds. Imagine an idea that occupies your mind the way an army occupies a city. Outside the car now is America. Oh, beautiful starling-filled skies over amber waves of tansy ragwort. Oh, purple mountains of loose strife above the bubonic plagued plain. America, a siege of ideas, the whole power grab of life. After listening to Oyster, a glass of milk isn't just a nice drink with chocolate chip cookies. It's cows forced to stay pregnant and pumped with hormones. It's inevitable calves that live a few miserable months squeezed in veal boxes. A pork chop means a pig, stabbed and bleeding, with a snare around 1 foot, being hung up to die screaming as it's sectioned into chops and roasts and lard. Even a hard-boiled egg is a hen with her feet crippling from living in a battery cage, only 4 inches wide, so narrow she can't raise her wings, so maddening her beak is cut off so she won't attack the hens trapped on each side of her. With her feathers rubbed off by the cage and her beak cut, she lays egg after egg until her bones are so depleted of calcium that they shatter at the slaughterhouse. This is the chicken in chicken noodle soup. The laying hens. The hens so bruised and scarred that they have to be shredded and cooked because nobody would ever buy them in a butcher's case. This is the chicken in corn dogs. Chicken nuggets. This is all Oyster talks about. This is his plague of information. This is when I turn on the radio, to country and Western music, to basketball, anything. So long as it's loud and constant and lets me pretend my breakfast sandwich is just a breakfast sandwich. That an animal is just that. An egg is just an egg. Cheese isn't a tiny suffering veal. That eating this is my right as a human being. Here's Big Brother singing and dancing so I don't start thinking too much for my own good. In the local newspaper today, there's another dead fashion model. There's an ad that says, "Attention Patreons of Falling Star Puppy Farm," it says. "If your new dog spreads infectious rabies to any child in your household, you may be eligible to take part in a class action lawsuit." Driving through what used to be beautiful, natural country while eating what used to be an egg sandwich, I asked why they couldn't just buy the 3 books they were shopping for at the book barn. Oyster and Helen, or just steal the pages and leave the rest of the books. I say, the reason we're making this trip is so people won't be burning books. Relax, Helen says, driving. The store had 3 copies of the book. The problem was they didn't know where. And Oyster says, they were all misshelved. Mona's head is asleep in his lap, and he's peeling apart the strands of her hair into skis of red and black. It's the only way she falls asleep, he says. She'd sleep forever if I keep doing this. For whatever reason, my wife comes to mind, my wife and daughter. What with the sirens and fire engines, we were all awake all night. That book barn place was like a rat's warren, Helen says. Oyster's braiding the broken bits of civilization into Mona's hair. The artifacts from my foot, the broken columns and stairways and lightning rods. He's pulling apart her Navajo dream catcher and braids and I Ching coins and glass beads and cords into her hair. The Easter shades of blue and pink feathers. We spent the entire evening searching, Helen says. We checked every book in the children's section. We looked through science. We checked religion. We checked philosophy, poetry, folk stories. We checked ethnic literature. We checked all through fiction. And Oyster says, the books were on their computer inventory, but just lost in the store. So they burned the whole place for 3 books. They burned tens of thousands of books to make sure those 3 were destroyed. It seemed our only realistic option, Helen says. You know what those books can do. For whatever reason, Sodom and Gomorrah come to mind. How God would spare the city if there was even one good person still in it. Here's just the opposite. Thousands killed in order to destroy a few. Imagine a new dark age. Imagine the books burning and the tapes and films and files and radios and televisions will all go into the same bonfire. If we're preventing that world or creating it, I don't know. It said on the television how 2 security guards were found dead after the fire. Actually, Helen says, they were dead long before the fire. We needed some time to spread the gasoline. We're killing people to save lives. We're burning books to save books. I ask, what is this trip turning into? What it's always been, Oyster says, threading some hair through I Ching coin. It's a big power grab, he says. You want to keep the world the way it is, Dad, with just you in charge. Helen, he says, wants the same world, but with her in charge. Every generation wants to be the last. Every generation hates the next trend in music they can't understand. We hate to give up those reins of our culture, to find our own music playing in elevators. The ballad for our revolution turned into background music for a television commercial, to find our generation's clothes and hair suddenly retro. Me, Oyster says, I'm all for wiping the slate clean of books and people and starting over. I'm for nobody being in charge. With him and Mona as the new Adam and Eve? No, he says, smoothing the hair back from Mona's sleeping face. We'd have to go too. I ask, does he hate people so much that he'd kill the woman he loves? I ask, why doesn't he just kill himself? No, Oyster says, I just love everything the same. Plants, animals, humans. I just don't believe the big lie about how we continue to be fruitful and multiply without destroying ourselves. I say he's a traitor to his species. I'm a fucking patriot, Oyster says, and looks out his window. This culling poem is a blessing. Why do you think it was created in the first place? It will save millions of people from the slow, terrible death we're headed for from disease, from famine, drought, from solar radiation, from war, from all the places we're headed. So he's willing to kill himself and Mona? I ask, so what about his parents? Will he just kill them too? What about all the little children who've had little or no life? What about all the good, hardworking people who live green and recycle? The vegans, aren't they innocent in his mind? This isn't about guilt or innocence, he says. The dinosaurs weren't morally good or bad, but they're all dead. That kind of thinking makes him an Adolf Hitler, a Joseph Stalin, a serial killer, a mass murderer. And threading a stained glass window into Mona's hair, Oyster says, I want to be what killed the dinosaurs. And I say, it was an act of God that killed the dinosaurs. I say, I'm not going another mile with a wannabe mass murderer. And Oyster says, what about Dr. Sarah? Mom, help me out. How many others has Dad here already killed? And Helen says, I'm sewing my fish. At the sound of Oyster's cigarette lighter, I churn and ask, does he have to smoke? I say, I'm trying to eat. But Oyster's got Mona's book about primitive crafts, traditional tribal hobby crafts, and he's holding it open above the lighter, fanning the pages in the little flame. With his window open a crack, he slips the book out, letting the flames explode in the wind before he drops it. Cheatgrass loves fire. He says, books can be so evil. Mulberry needs to invent her own kind of spirituality. Helen's phone rings. Oyster's phone rings. Mona sighs and stretches her arms. With her eyes closed, Oyster's hands still picking through her hair, his phone still ringing, Mona grinds her head into Oyster's lap and says, maybe the grimoire will have a spell to stop overpopulation. Helen opens the planner book to today's date and writes a name. Into her phone, she says, don't bother with an exorcism. We can put the house right back on the market. Mona says, we need some kind of universal gelding spell. And I ask, isn't anybody here worried about going to hell? And Oyster takes his phone out of his medicine bag, his phone ringing and ringing. Helen puts her phone against her chest and says, don't think for a second that the government's not already working on some swell infectious ways to stop overpopulation. And Oyster says, in order to save the world, Jesus Christ suffered for about 36 hours on the cross. His phone ringing and ringing, he says, I'm willing to suffer an eternity in hell for the same cause. His phone ringing and ringing. Into her phone, Helen says, really? Your bedroom smells like sulfur? You figure out who's the better savior, Oyster says, and flips his cell phone open. Into the phone, he says, Dunbar, Dunway, and Dugan, attorneys at law. Chapter 27. Imagine if the Chicago fire of 1871 had gone on for 6 months before anybody noticed. Imagine if the Jonestown flood in 1889 or the 1906 San Francisco earthquake had lasted 6 months, a year, 2 years before anyone paid attention to it. Building with wood, building on fault lines, building on floor plains, on floodplains, each era creates its own natural disasters. Imagine a flood of dark green in the downtown of any major city. The office and condo towers submerged inch by inch. Now, here and now, I'm writing from Seattle. A day, a week, a month late. Who knows how far after the fact? The Sarge and me were still witch hunting. Hedera Helak Seattle. Botanists are calling this new variety of English ivy. 1 week, maybe the planters around the Olympic Professional Plaza, they looked a little overgrown. The ivy was crowding the pansies. Some vines had rooted into the side of the brick facade and were inching up. No one noticed. It had been raining a lot. No one noticed until the morning the residents of the Park Senior Living Center found their lobby doors sealed with ivy. That same day, the south wall of the Fremont Theater, brick and concrete 3 feet thick, it buckled onto a sellout crowd. That same day, part of the underground bus mall caved in. No one can really say when Hedera Hexel Seattle first took root, but if you can make a good guess. Looking through back issues of the Seattle Times, there's an ad in the May 5th entertainment section. 3 columns wide, it says, "Attention, Patreons of the Oracle Sushi Palace," the ad says. If you experience severe rectal itching caused by intestinal parasites, you may be eligible to take part in a class action lawsuit. Then it gives a phone number. Me, here with the Sarge, I call the number. A man's voice says, Denton, Daimler, and Dick, attorneys at law. And I say, Oyster? I say, where are you, you little fuck? And the line goes dead. Here and now, writing this in Seattle, in a diner just outside the Department of Public Works barricades, a waitress tells me, and Sarge, they can't kill the ivy now, and she pours us more coffee. She looks out the window at the walls of green, veined with fat gray vines. She says, it's the only thing holding that part of the town together. Inside the net of vines and leaves, the bricks are buckling and shifting. Cracks shatter the concrete. The windows are squeezed until the glass breaks. The door won't open because the frames are so warped. Birds fly in and out of the straight up green cliffs, eating the ivy seeds, shitting them everywhere. A block away, the streets are crayons of green. The asphalt and sidewalks buried in green. The green menace, the newspaper calls it, the ivy equivalent of killer bees, the ivy inferno. Silent, unstoppable. The end of civilization in slow motion. The waitress, she says every time city crews prune the vines or burn them with flamethrowers or spray them with poison, even the time they herded the pygmy goats to eat it, the ivy roots spread. The roots collapsed tunnels. They severed underground cables and pipes. The Sarge dials the number from the sushi ad again and again, but the line stays dead. The waitress looks at the fingers of ivy already coming across the street. In another week, she'll be out of a job. The National Guard promised us containment, she says. She says, I hear they've got the ivy in Portland now too, and San Francisco. She sighs and says, we're definitely losing this one. Chapter 28. The man opens his front door, and here are Helen and I on his front porch, me carrying Helen's cosmetic case, standing a half step behind her as Helen points the long pink fingernails of her index finger and says, oh God. She has her daily planner tucked under one arm and says, my husband, and she steps back. My husband would like to witness to you about the promise of our Lord Jesus Christ. Helen's suit is yellow, but not a buttercup yellow. It's more the yellow of a buttercup made of gold and pave citrons by Carl Fabergé. The man's holding a bottle of beer. He's wearing gray sweat socks with no shoes. His bathrobe hangs open in the front, and inside he's wearing a white t-shirt and boxer shorts patterned with little race cars. With one hand, he sticks the beer in his mouth. His head tips back. The bubbles gulp up inside the bottle. The little race cars have oval tires tilted forward. The man belches and says, you guys for real? He has black hair hanging down a wrinkled Frankenstein forehead. He has sad, baggy hound dog eyes. My hand out front to shake his, I say, Mr. Sierra? I say, we're here to share the joy of God's love. And the race car guy frowns and says, how is it you know my name? He squints at me and says, did Bonnie send you to talk to me? And Helen leans around him, looking into the living room. She snaps open her purse and takes out a pair of white gloves and starts wriggling her fingers inside. She buttons a little button at the cuff of each glove and says, may we come in? It was supposed to be easier than this. Plan B. If we find a man at home, we bring out Plan B. The race car guy puts the beer bottle in his mouth, and his stubby cheeks suck it around it. His head tilts back and the rest of the beer bubbles away. He steps to one side and says, well, sit down. He looks at the empty bottle and says, can I get you a beer? We step in, and he goes into the kitchen. There's a hiss of him popping a bottle cap. In the whole living room, there's just a recliner chair. There's a little portable television sitting on the milk crate. Out through sliding glass doors, you can see a patio. Lined up along the far edge of the patio are green floor spaces, brimful of rain, rotted black flowers bent and falling out of them, rotted brown roses on black sticks fuzzy with gray mold. Tied around one arrangement is a wide black satin ribbon. In the living room shag carpet, there's the ghost outlines left by a sofa. There's the outlines left by a china cabinet, the little dents left by the feet of chairs and tables. There's a big flat square where the carpet is all crushed the same. It looks so similar and familiar. The race car guy waves at me at the recliner and says, "Sit down." He drinks some beer and says, "Sit, and we'll talk about what God's really like." The big flat square in the carpet, it was left by a playpen. I ask if my wife can use his bathroom, and he tilts his head to one side, looking at Helen. With his free hand, he stretches the back of his neck. He scratches the back of his neck, saying, "Sure, it's at the end of the hall," and he waves with his beer bottle. Helen looks at the beer sloshed out on the carpet, and says, "Thank you." She takes her daily planner from under her arm and hands it to me, saying, "In case you need it, here's a Bible." Her book full of political targets and real estate closings. Great. It's still warm from her armpit. She disappears down the hallway. The sound of a bathroom fan comes on. A door shuts somewhere. "Sit," the race car guy says. And I sit. He stands over me so close. I'm afraid to open the daily planner, afraid he'll see it's not really a Bible. He smells like beer and sweat. The little race cars are eye level with me. The oval tires are tilted so they look like they're going fast. The guy takes another drink and says, "Tell me all about God." The recliner chair smells like him. It's gold velvet, darker brown on the arms from dirt. It's warm. And I say God's a noble, hard-line moralist who refuses to accept anything but steadfast, righteous conduct. He's a bastion of upright standards, a lamp that shines its light to reveal the evil in this world. God's will always be in our heart. God will always be in our hearts and souls because his own soul is so strong and so Bullshit, says the guy. He turns away and goes to look out the patio doors. His face is reflected in the glass, just his eyes with his dark, stubbly jaw lost in shadow. In my best radio preacher voice, I say how God is the moral yardstick against which millions of people must measure their own lives. He's the flaming sword sent down to root the misdeeds and evildoers from the temple of bullshit, the guy shouts at his reflection in the glass door. Beer spray runs down his reflected face. Helen is standing in the doorway to the hall, one hand in her mouth, chewing her knuckle. She looks at me and shrugs. She disappears back down the hallway. From the gold velvet recliner, I say how God is an angel of unparalleled power and impact, a conscience for the world around him, a world of sin and cruel intent, a world of hidden. In almost a whisper, the guy says, "Bullshit." The fog of his breath has erased his reflection. He turns to look at me, pointing at me with his beer in his hand, saying, "Read to me where it says in your Bible something that will fix things." Helen's daily organizer bound in red leather. I open it a crack and peek inside. "Tell me how to prove to the police I didn't kill anybody," the guy says. In the organizer is the name, Rennie O'Toole, and the date, June 2nd. Whoever he is, he's dead. On September 10th, Samara Yipsiri is entered. On August 17th, Helen closed a deal for a house on Gardner Hill Road. That, and she killed the tyrant king of the Toggle Empire, the Tongol Republic. Read, the race car guy shouts. The beer in his hand foams over his fingers and drips on the carpet. He says, read to me where it says I can lose everything in one night and people are going to say it's my fault. I peek in the book and it's more names of dead people. Read, the guy says, and drinks his beer. You read where it says a wife can accuse her husband of killing their kid and everybody is supposed to believe her. Early in the book, the writing is faded and hard to read. The pages are stiff and fly-speckled. Before that, somebody started tearing out the oldest pages. I asked God, the guy says. He shakes his beer at me and says, I asked him to give me a family. I went to church. I say how maybe God didn't start out by attacking and berating everybody who prayed. I say maybe it was after years and years of getting the same prayers about unwanted pregnancies, about divorces, about family squabbles. Maybe it was because God's audience grew and more people were making demands. Maybe it was the more praise he got. Maybe power corrupts, but he wasn't always a bastard. And the race car guy says, listen. He says, I go to court in 2 days to decide if I'm accused of murder, he says. You can tell me how God is going to save me. His breath nothing but beer, he says. You tell me. Mona would have me tell the truth, to save this guy, to save myself and Helen, to reunite us with humanity. Maybe this guy and his wife would reunite, but then the poem would be out. Millions would die. The rest would live in that world of silence, hearing only what they think is safe, plugging their ears and burning books, movies, music. Somewhere a toilet flushes, a bathroom fan shuts off, a door opens. The guy puts the beer in his mouth and bubbles glug up inside the bottle. Helen appears in the doorway to the hall. My foot aches and I ask, has he considered taking up a hobby? Maybe something he could do in prison. Constructive deconstruction. I'm sure Helen would approve of the sacrifice, condemning one innocent man so millions don't die. Here's every lab animal who dies to save a dozen cancer patients. And the race car guy says, I think you'd better leave. Walking out to the car, I hand Helen the daily planner and tell her, here's your Bible. My pager goes off and it's some number I don't know. Her white gloves are black with dust, and she says she tore up the culling song page and dropped it in the nursery out. She dropped it out the nursery window. It's raining. The paper will rot. I say that's not good enough. Some kid could find it. Just the fact that it's tore up will make someone want to put it back together. Some detective investigating the death of a child, maybe. And Helen says, that bathroom was a nightmare. We drive around the block and park. Mona's scribbling in the back seat, oysters on his phone. Then Helen waits while I crouch down and walk back to the house. I duck around the back, the wet lawn sucking at my shoes until I'm under the window. Helen says is the nursery. The window's still open, the curtains hanging out a little at the bottom. Pink curtains. The torn bits of page are scattered in the mud, and I start to pick them all up. Behind the curtains, in the empty room, you can hear the door open. The outline of somebody comes in from the hallway, and I crouch in the mud under the window. A man's hand comes down on the windowsill, so I pull back flat against the house. From somewhere above me where I can't see, a man starts crying. It starts to rain harder. The man stands in the window, leaning both hands on the open sill. He sobs louder. You can smell the beer inside of him. Me, I can't run. I can't stand up. With my hands clamped over my nose and mouth, I crouch inches away, squeezed tight against the foundation, hidden. And hitting me as fast as a chill, me breathing between my fingers, I start to cry too. Sobs as hard as vomiting. My belly cramps, my teeth biting into my palm, the snot sprays into my hands. The man sniffs, hard and bubbling. It's raining harder, and water seeps into my shoes through my laces. The torn bits of the poem in my hand. I hold the power of life and death. I just can't do anything. Not yet. And maybe you don't go to hell for the things you do. Maybe you go to hell for the things you don't do. My shoes full of cold water, my foot stops hurting. My hands slick with snot and tears, I reach down and turn off my pager. When we find the grimoire, if there is some way to raise the dead, maybe we won't burn it. Not right away. Chapter 29. The police report doesn't say how warm my wife, Gina, felt when I woke up that morning, how soft and warm she felt under the covers, how when I churned next to her, she rolled onto her back, her hair fanned out on the pillow. Her head was tipped a little toward one shoulder. Her morning skin smelled warm, the way sunlight looks bouncing off a white tablecloth in a nice restaurant near the beach on your honeymoon. Sun came through the blue curtains, making her skin blue, her lips blue, her eyelashes were laying across each cheek. Her mouth was a loose smile. Still half asleep, I cupped my hand behind her neck and tilted her face back and kissed her. Her neck and shoulder were so easy and relaxed. Still kissing her warm, relaxed mouth, I pulled her nightgown up around her waist. Her legs seemed to roll apart, and my hand found her loose and wet inside. Under the covers, my eyes closed. I worked my tongue inside with my wet fingers. I peeled back the smooth pink edges of her and licked deeper, the tide of air going in and out of me. At the top of each breath, I drove my mouth up into her. For once, Katrin had slept the whole night and wasn't crying. My mouth climbed to Gina's belly button. It climbed to her breast. With one wet finger in her mouth, my other fingers flick across her nipples. My mouth cups over her other breast, and my tongue touches the nipple inside. Gina's head rolled to one side, and I licked the back of her ear. My hips pressing her legs apart, and I put myself inside. The loose smile on her face, the way her mouth came open at the last moment and her head sunk deep into the pillow. She was so quiet. It was the best it had been since before Katrin was born. A minute later, I slipped out of bed and took a shower. I tiptoed into my clothes and eased the bedroom door shut behind me. In the nursery, I kissed Katrin on the side of her head. I felt her diaper. The sun came through the yellow curtains, her toys and books. She looked so perfect. I felt so blessed. No one in the world was as lucky as me that morning. Here, driving Helen's car with her asleep in the front seat beside me. Tonight we're in Ohio or Iowa or Idaho with Mona sleeping in the back, Helen's pink hair pillowed against my shoulder. Mona sprawled in the rearview mirror, sprawled in her coloring pens and books. Oyster asleep. This is the life I have now, for better or for worse, for richer or poorer. That was my last really good day. It wasn't until I came home from work that I knew the truth. Gina was still lying in the same position. The police report would call it postmortem sexual intercourse. Nash comes to mind. Katrin was still quiet. The underside of her head had turned dark red. Livor mortis, oxygenated hemoglobin. It wasn't until I came home that I knew what I'd done. Here, parked in the leather smell of Helen's big realtor car, the sun is just above the horizon. It's the same moment now as it was then. We parked under a tree on a tree-lined street in a neighborhood of little houses. It's the same kind of flowering tree, and all night pink flower petals have fallen on the car, sticking to the dew. Helen's car is pink as a parade float, covered in flowers, and I'm spying out through just a hole where the petals don't cover the windshield. The morning light shining in through the layer of petals is pink, rose-colored. On Helen and Mona and Oyster asleep. Down the block, an old couple is working in the flower beds along their foundation. The old man fills a watering can at a spigot. The old woman kneels, pulling weeds. I turn my pager back on and it starts beeping right away. Helen jerks awake. The phone number on my pager, I don't recognize it. Helen sits up, blinking, looking at me. She looks at the tiny sparkling watch on her wrist. On one side of her face are deep red pock marks where she slept on her dangling emerald earrings. She looks at the layer of pink covering all the windows. She plunges the pink fingernails of both hands into her hair and fluffs it, saying, "Where are we now?" Some people still think knowledge is power. I tell her I have no idea. Chapter 30. Mona stands at my elbow. She holds a glossy brochure open, pushing it in my face, saying, "Can we go here? Please? Just for a couple of hours. Please?" Photographs in the brochure show people screaming with their hands in the air, riding a roller coaster. Photos show people driving go-karts around a track outlined in old tires. More people are eating cotton candy and riding plastic horses on a merry-go-round. Other people are locked into seats on a Ferris wheel. Along the top of the brochure, in big scrolling letters, it says, "Laughland, the family place." Except in place of the A's are 4 laughing clown faces. A mother, a father, a son, a daughter. We have another 84 books to disarm. That's dozens more libraries in cities all over the country. Then there's a grimoire to find. There's people to bring back from the dead, or just castrate. Or there's all of humanity to kill, depending on whom you ask. There's so much we need to get fixed, to get back to God, as Mona would say, just to break even. Karl Marx would say we've made every plant and animal our enemy to justify killing it. In the newspaper today, it says the husband of one of the fashion models is being held under suspicion of murder. I'm standing at a public phone outside some small town library while Helen's inside trashing another book with Oyster. A man's voice on the phone says, "Homicide Division." Into the phone, I ask, "Who is this?" And the voice says, Detective Ben Danton, Homicide Division." He says, "Who is this?" "A police detective. Mona would call him my savior, sent to wrangle me back into the fold with the rest of humanity. This is the number that's been appearing on my pager for the past couple of days." Mona turns the brochure over and says, "Just look." Braided in her hair are broken windmills and train trestles and radio towers. Photos show smiling children getting hugged by clouds. It shows parents strolling hand in hand and riding little skiffs through a tunnel of love. She says, "This trip doesn't have to be all work." Helen comes out of the library doors and starts down the front steps, and Mona turns and rushes at her, saying, "Helen, Mr. Streditor said it was okay." And I put the payphone receiver to my chest and say, "I did not." Oyster is hanging back a step behind Helen's elbow. Mona holds the brochure on Helen's face, saying, "Look how much fun." On the phone, Detective Danton says, "Who is this?" It was okay to sacrifice the poor guy in the raised car boxer shorts. It's okay to sacrifice the young woman in the apron printed with little chickens. To not tell them the truth, to not let them suffer, and to sacrifice the widower or some fashion model. But sacrificing me to save the millions is another thing altogether. Into the phone I say my name, Streditor, and that he paged me. "Mr. Streditor," he says, "we'd like you to come in for questioning." I ask, "About what?" "Why don't we talk about that in person?" he says. I ask if this is about a death. "When can you make it in?" he says. I ask if this is about a series of deaths with no apparent reason. "Sooner would be better than later," he says. I ask if this is because one victim was my upstairs neighbor and 3 were my editors. And Danton says, "You don't say." I ask if this is because I passed 3 more victims in the street the moment before they each died. And Danton says, "That's news to me." I ask if this is because I stood within spitting distance of the young sideburns guy who died in the bar on 3rd Avenue. "Uh-huh," he says. "You mean Marty Latanzi?" I ask if this is because all the dead fashion models show signs of post-mortem sex, the same way my wife did 20 years ago. And no doubt, they have security camera film of me talking to a librarian named Simon at the moment he dropped dead. You can hear a pencil somewhere scratching fast notes on paper. Away from the phone, I can hear someone else say, "Keep him on the line." I ask if this is really a ploy to arrest me for suspicion of murder. And Detective Denton says, "Don't make us issue a bench warrant. The more people die, the more things stay the same." "Officer Danton," I ask, "can you tell me where to find him at this exact moment?" Sticks and stones may break your bones, but here we go again. Fast as a scream, the culling song spins through my head and the phone line goes dead. I've killed my savior, Detective Ben Danton. I'm that much further from the rest of humanity. Constructive deconstruction. Oyster shakes his plastic cigarette lighter, slapping it against the palm of one hand. Then he gives it to Helen and watches while she takes a folded page out of her purse. She lights the page 27 and holds it over the gutter. While Mona's reading the brochure, Helen holds the burning page near the edge of it. The photos of happy, smiling families puff into flame, and Mona shrieks and drops them. Still holding the burning page, Helen kicks the burning families into the gutter. The fire in her hand gets bigger and bigger, stuttering and smoking in the breeze. And for whatever reason, I think of Nash and his burning fuse. Helen says, "I don't do fun." With her other hand, Helen jingles her car keys at me. Then it happens. Oyster has his arm locked around Helen's head from behind. That fast, he knocks her off her feet, and as she throws her arms out for balance, he grabs the burning poem, the culling song. Helen drops to her knees, drops out of his grip. She cries just one little scream when her knees hit the concrete sidewalk, and she tumbles into the gutter, her keys still in her fist. Oyster beats the burning page against his thigh. He holds it in both hands, his eyes twitching back and forth, reading down the page as the fire rolls up from the bottom. Both his hands are on fire before he lets go, yelling, "No!" and sticks his fingers in his mouth. Mona steps back, her hands pressed over her ears, her eyes squeezed shut. Helen on her hands and knees in the gutter next to the burning families, she looks up at Oyster. Oyster as good as dead. Helen's hairdo is broken open, the pink hair hangs in her eyes. Her nylons are torn, her knees bloody. Don't kill him, Mona yells. Don't kill him. Please don't kill him. Oyster drops to his knees and grabs at the burned paper on the sidewalk. And slow as the hour hand on a clock, Helen rises to her feet. Her face is red. It's not the red of a Burmese ruby. It's more the red of blood running down from her knees. With Oyster kneeling, with Helen standing over him, with Mona holding both hands over her ears, squeezing her eyes shut, Oyster shifting through his ashes. Helen's bleeding. Me, I'm still watching from the phone booth, and a flock of starlings flies up from the roof of the library. Oyster, the evil, resentful, violent son Helen might have, if she still had a son. Just the same old power grab. Go ahead, Oyster says, and he lifts his head to meet Helen's eyes. He smiles with just half of his mouth and says, You killed your real son. You can kill me. And then it happens. Helen slaps him hard across the face, dragging her fistful of keys through each cheek. A moment later, more blood. Another scarred parasite, another mutilated cockroach or more. And Helen's eyes snap up from Oyster's bleeding to the starlings circling above us. And bird by bird they drop, their black feathers flashing an oily blue, their dead eyes just staring back, their dead eyes just staring black beads. Oyster holds his face, both his hands full of blood. Helen glaring up into the sky, the shining black bodies hiss down and bounce, bird by bird, around us on the concrete. Constructive deconstruction. Chapter 31. A mile outside of town, Helen pulls over to the side of the highway. She puts on the car's emergency flashers. Looking at nothing but her hands, her skin-tight calfskin driving gloves on the steering wheel, she says, Get out. On the window shield, there are little contact lenses of water. It's starting to rain. Fine, Oyster says, and jerks his car door open. He says, Isn't this what people do with dogs they can't house train? His face and hands are smeared with red and blood. The devil's face. His shattered blonde hair sticks up from his forehead, stiff and red as devil's horns. His red goatee. In all this red, his eyes are white. It's not the white of white flags surrender. It's the white of hard-boiled eggs, crippled chickens in battery cages, factory farm misery and suffering and death. Just like Adam and Eve getting evicted from the Garden of Eden, he says. Oyster stands on the gravel shoulder of the highway and leans down to look at Mona still in the back seat, and he says, You coming, Eve? It's not about love. It's about control. Behind Oyster, the sun's going down. Behind him is Russian thistle and Scotch broom and kudzu. Behind him, the whole world's a mess. And Mona, with the ruins of Western civilization braided into her hair, the bits of Dreamcatcher and I Ching, she looks at her black fingernails in her lap and says, Oyster, what you did is wrong. Oyster puts his hand into the car, reaches across the street to her, his hand red and clotted, and he says, Mulberry, despite all your herbal good intentions, this trip is not going to work. He says, Come with me. Mona sets her teeth together and snaps her face to look at him, saying, You threw away my Indian crafts book, she says. That book was very important to me. Some people still think knowledge is power. Mulberry, honey, Oyster says, and strokes her hair, the hair sticking to his bloody hand. He tucks the skein of hair behind her ear and says, That book was fucked. Fine, Mona says, and she pulls away and folds her arms. And Oyster says, fine, and he slams the car door, his hand leaving a bloody print on the window. His red hands raised at his sides. Oyster steps back from the car. Shaking his head, he says, forget about me. I'm just another one of God's alligators you can flush down the toilet. Helen shifts the car into drive. She touches some switch and Oyster's door locks. And from outside the locked door, muffled and fuzzy, Oyster yells, you can flush me, but I'll just keep eating shit, he shouts, and I'll just keep growing. Helen puts on her turn signal and starts out into traffic. You can forget me, Oyster yells with his red, yelling devil face, his teeth big and white, he yells. But that doesn't mean I don't still exist. For whatever reason, the first gypsy moth that flew out a window in Medford, Massachusetts in 1860 comes to mind. In driving, Helen touches her eye with one finger, and when she puts her hand back on the steering wheel, the gloved finger is a darker brown, wet. And for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, this is her life. Mona puts her face in both hands and starts to sob. And counting 1, counting 2, counting 3, I turn on the radio. Okay, guys. Well, we're coming up on 2 hours. So we're on chapter 32. And next time, I feel like it'll be about maybe like 2 hours and 15 minutes. It won't be that much longer than normal. And then we'll be done with the book. So definitely we will be doing it this week so we can finish the book this week. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining me. Sorry I don't say hi and bye. I just want people to be able to come in and just listen. And we do that normally on lives. But thank you guys so much for being here and supporting me. And I hope you guys like it. And you guys like it that it's live because there are mistakes. So hopefully you guys don't mind. Thank you guys so much for coming. Have a really good night. Have a blessed week. And I'll see you guys soon. Good night.